Do you know what awaits you, child, beyond the Holy Lands?
No, but I know who waits, the Lord, in glory.
You speak like the others, all fire, all faith, but faith is a delicate flame. Wind, hunger, blood, they test it.
Let them try.
Then take up your cross, Sir Calen of Aris, and may your soul endure what your sword cannot.
Time to ride, boy. Your holy war won't wait for your tears.
The year 1096 AD dawned with the fervor of a divine promise, echoing from the pulpits of Europe, across the cobbled streets of villages, and into the grand halls of knights and lords. Pope Urban II's clarion call at Claremont had ignited a fire in the hearts of men, a holy flame promising absolution for sins and a crown of glory in the eternal kingdom for those who would reclaim the Holy Land from the Saracen defilers. It was a pilgrimage, a penance, and a crusade, all wrapped in the shimmering banner of God's will. Sir Calen, a knight barely past his 20th year, felt the surge of that righteous tide in his blood. His lands in northern France were modest, his lineage respected but not grand. Yet in his soul burned a conviction as pure and bright as the morning star. He saw himself as a vessel of divine purpose, destined to cleanse the sacred earth where Christ had walked. He had knelt before his bishop, received his cross, and pledged his life to the cause, leaving behind the comforting green fields of his home and the tearful farewells of his younger sister, Ilara, her face etched in his memory like a sacred icon. His companion, Sir Gareth, was a man cut from a different cloth. Older, perhaps 50, with eyes that had seen too many winters and too many battles not to hold a cynical gleam. He bore his cross with a quiet resignation rather than fervent zeal. Gareth had fought in the shadow wars of feudal lords, had seen men die for less than God, and understood the brutal arithmetic of steel and bone. He was Calen's mentor, a grizzled veteran who had trained him in the sword and shield, and now walked beside him on this grand, perilous journey. He spoke little of heavenly rewards, more the necessity of keeping one's blade sharp and one's stomach full.
God helps those who help themselves, lad.
He'd gruffly advise, his words often punctuated by a spitting of dust. The initial stages of the journey were a grand spectacle of faith and ambition. Thousands upon thousands marched, a river of humanity flowing eastward. Knights in their shining mail, foot soldiers with their crude weapons, priests clutching their crucifixes, merchants seeking profit, women and children, camp followers, prostitutes, and pilgrims driven by a simplistic piety. The air vibrated with hymns and prayers, the clang of smiths repairing armor, the braying of pack animals, and the constant murmur of a multitude on the move. They traversed the verdant valleys of the Rhine, crossed the towering Alps, and descended into the sun-baked plains of Hungary and Bulgaria. But the magnificent procession soon began to fray at the edges. Discipline, never a strong suit among such a disparate collection of wills, slowly eroded. Supplies, initially abundant, dwindled. Local populations, at first awed by the sheer numbers of the Frankish host, grew wary, then hostile, as the Crusaders, driven by hunger and impatience, began to forage, then to pillage. Skirmishes broke out, not against Saracens, but against fellow Christians. Calen witnessed the ugly side of piety, fanaticism that justified murder, greed that led to theft, and lust that led to rape. His idealism, though not extinguished, began to flicker. He found solace in Gareth's stoicism and the shared burden of their daily march. Disease was an invisible enemy, more potent than any Saracen arrow. Dysentery swept through the camps, felling the weak and the strong alike. Kalen saw men he had broken bread with stumble, sicken, and die within days, their bodies left by the roadside, a grim marker of their relentless eastward advance. The stench of unburied dead, of unsanitary camps, became a constant companion. Brother Elias, a gaunt, fervent monk who had attached himself to their small company, spoke of trials and purification, of God testing their faith. Elias, with his burning eyes and skeletal frame, seemed sustained by prayer alone, his faith a fragile but indomitable shield against the encroaching despair. By the time they reached Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, the host was a shadow of its former self. Their numbers had been culled by disease, desertion, and internal strife. Emperor Alexios Komnenos, wary of this unruly Western force, grudgingly provided provisions and guides, eager to see them cross the Bosphorus and be gone from his lands. Kalen gazed upon the magnificent city, its golden domes gleaming under the sun, and felt a surge of hope. This was the threshold to the Holy Land, the final leap. The passage into Anatolia, however, was a descent into a new kind of hell. The land was harsh, unforgiving, often stripped bare by the retreating Turks. Water became a precious commodity, fought over, dreamed of. The sun beat down relentlessly, baking the earth in cracking lips. Mirages shimmered on the horizon, taunting them with visions of cool lakes and verdant oases that dissolved into shimmering air. They fought their first major battles against the Seljuk Turks, fierce, mobile warriors who struck with terrifying speed and then vanished into the vastness of the plains. Kalen felt the true terror of combat, the metallic tang of blood in his mouth, the sickening thud of blade against bone, the guttural screams of dying men. Gareth, surprisingly, seemed to come alive in these moments, his movements precise and deadly, a grim reaper in dented mail. Their journey became a slow, agonizing crawl, punctuated by skirmishes, hunger, and thirst. The once bright enthusiasm of the Crusaders had been replaced by a grim determination, an unspoken pact to reach their destination or die trying. The dream of Jerusalem, once a beacon of glory, had narrowed to the immediate goal: survival. Finally, after months of relentless marching and fighting, a murmur rippled through the weary host. Ahead, on the horizon, a formidable silhouette rose against the setting sun, the ancient city of Antioch. Its massive walls, rumored to be impregnable, climbed the slopes of Mount Silpius, its numerous towers piercing the sky like the teeth of a monstrous beast. The Orontes River snaked past its western gate, adding to its natural defenses. This was Antioch, capital of Syria, a strategic jewel, and the gateway to the Levant. It was also, as they would soon discover, their grave. Kalen felt a mix of awe and trepidation. The scale of the task ahead was daunting. He saw the gleam in the eyes of his fellow Crusaders, a desperate hope rekindled. They had endured so much. Surely, God would grant them victory here. Little did he know, Antioch would not be just a battle, but a crucible where faith would be tested beyond human endurance, and the very definition of humanity would be stripped bare. The Crusader host, numbering perhaps 30,000 effective fighters, though estimates varied wildly, settled into a grim encampment outside Antioch's formidable walls in October of 1097. The city, ancient and immense, seemed to mock their numbers. Its defenses were legendary, a double ring of walls, each 30 feet high and 10 feet thick, studded with over 400 towers. Its governor, Yagi Sayan, was a seasoned Turkish commander, renowned for his tenacity. Initial optimism, born of sheer relief at having reached their target, buoyed the Crusaders' spirits. They believed Antioch would fall swiftly, a prelude to their march on Jerusalem. They began building siege engines, towering mangonels, trebuchets, and formidable wooden siege towers. Kalen, under Gareth's experienced eye, helped in the grueling construction, his muscles aching from the unfamiliar labor, his hopes still relatively high. Brother Elias, meanwhile, moved among the men, offering prayers and sermons, reminding them of the sanctity of their mission. But the days stretched into weeks, and the weeks into months. Antioch refused to yield. Its defenders were numerous and fiercely determined. Sally after sally from the city gates harassed the Crusader lines, inflicting heavy casualties. The Crusaders, lacking proper siege tactics and engineers, found their efforts often fruitless. Their siege engines were destroyed, their assaults repulsed. The walls of Antioch seemed truly impregnable. The early days of the siege were marked by a slow, insidious erosion of their strength. Disease, ever present, continued its relentless culling. Dysentery, typhoid, and scurvy began to take hold, their effects exacerbated by the cold bite of winter that descended upon them. The ground turned to mud, then to ice. Rain turned tents into freezing quagmires. Men shivered in their damp armor, their teeth chattering. The sick lay shivering in their own waste, their moans a constant background hum of misery. Food, initially, was a challenge but manageable. Foraging parties were sent out, venturing further and further into the surrounding countryside to seize whatever provisions they could find. Kalen often joined them, the risk of ambush by Turkish cavalry a constant shadow. They brought back grain, cattle, and whatever meager crops they could strip from the fields. But as the besiegers' numbers dwindled and the surrounding lands became barren, these forays yielded less and less. The winter of 1097 to 1098 proved to be an adversary more potent than any Saracen blade. Sleet and snow fell relentlessly, burying the camps under a shroud of white. The Orontes River, usually a source of sustenance, often froze over, cutting off their access to water and further isolating them. The cold seeped into their bones, leading to frostbite and gangrene. Many nights, Kalen would huddle with Gareth and Elias around a meager fire, sharing silent dread as the wind howled like a banshee through the camp, carrying the faint, mournful cries of the dying. Famine began its slow, merciless strangulation. First, the provisions ran low. Then the animals, horses, mules, even dogs, were slaughtered for their meat. Gareth, always practical, taught Kalen how to skin a dog, how to cook its sinewy flesh over an open fire, a bitter, gamey meal that barely staved off the gnawing pangs. The starving animals themselves became a source of food. Mice, rats, insects, anything that scuttled or crawled became fair game. Kalen once saw a man gnaw on a leather strap, trying to extract any last nutrient for the hardened hide. Despair, a creeping, insidious poison, settled over the Crusader camp. Men who had once spoken of divine glory now spoke only of food, of the pain in their bellies, of the impossibility of their task. Desertions became common, a silent exodus of disillusioned warriors slipping away into the night, hoping to find their way back to a world where hunger was not a daily torment. Many perished in their attempts, falling prey to Turkish patrols or succumbing to the elements. Kalen felt his own faith waver. He prayed, but his prayers felt hollow, lost in the vast, indifferent sky. Where was God's mercy? Where was his promised deliverance? Brother Elias, too, seemed to shrink, his sermons growing shorter, his eyes holding a haunted look. He still spoke of God's will, but his voice lacked the former conviction, replaced by a desperate plea for perseverance. Yet, amidst the suffering, a strange sense of camaraderie formed. The shared misery bound them, a bond forged in the crucible of deprivation. They shared the last crusts of bread, the meager sips of foul water. Kalen and Gareth became a silent unit, their understanding needing no words. They watched each other's backs, offered a fleeting touch of reassurance, a shared sigh of exhaustion. The leaders of the crusade, Godfrey, Raymond, Bohemond, were not immune to the suffering. They too endured the gnawing hunger, though perhaps with slightly more provisions. They argued, accused each other of hoarding, of incompetence. The Grand Alliance threatened to fracture under the strain. There were pleas sent to Constantinople, desperate dispatches begging for reinforcements, for food, for any sign of hope. The besieged in Antioch, however, were not without their own suffering. Though better supplied, their numbers were finite, and the constant threat of the Crusaders outside meant their lives too were lived under siege. From the walls, they hurled insults, arrows, and occasionally the heads of captured Crusaders. It was a war of attrition, a test of wills, and the Crusaders, for all their piety and numbers, were losing. Kalen remembered the taste of fresh bread, the warmth of a fire in his childhood home, the laughter of Alara. These memories became both a torture and a lifeline, a flickering image of a world that seemed impossibly distant, a world of plenty and peace that might as well have been a dream. His body was a cage of pain, his mind a battlefield of despair and the primal urge to survive. The siege had stripped away the layers of civilization, leaving only the raw, desperate animal within. And soon, that animal would be truly unleashed. As the winter deepened into its cruelest months, the famine reached unimaginable levels. Every blade of grass within the Crusader camp had been stripped bare. The very soil was sifted for stray crumbs. The few remaining horses were nothing but skeletons covered in hide, their legs trembling as they stood. When they finally collapsed, they were devoured within minutes, their bones picked clean. Then came the leather. Kalen watched in horror and fascination as men boiled their boots, their belts, their shield straps, trying to soften the tough hide enough to chew and swallow. The leather offered no sustenance, only a false sense of having eaten, a brief distraction from the stomach's constant, agonizing roar. Kalen himself gnawed on his own gauntlets, the taste of cured animal skin a dry, acrid punishment. The dead became a silent, ever-present reality. Their numbers swelled with each passing day, victims of starvation, disease, and the relentless Turkish attacks. Burial parties, once solemn affairs, became hasty, perfunctory acts. The ground was too hard, the strength of the living too diminished. Bodies were often left where they fell, covered thinly with dirt, or simply abandoned. The air, even in the biting cold, carried the faint, sickly sweet stench of decomposition. It was during this nadir of suffering, in the bitter heart of February, that whispers began to circulate, hushed and full of a terrible shame. At first, they were dismissed as madness, the raving of starved minds. But the whispers persisted, growing louder, more desperate. Brother Elias, his face gaunt and shadowed, spoke of it first in their small company, his voice barely above a whisper. Men are eating the Saracen dead, Kalen. He choked, his eyes wide with a mixture of revulsion and a dawning, terrible understanding. And not just the heathens, even our own. Kalen felt a cold dread grip him, colder than the winter air. He had heard the rumors, of course, of desperate, half-mad men driven to madness by hunger, feasting on the bodies of fallen enemies after skirmishes, tearing at the flesh like wolves. He had dismissed it as barbarous exaggeration, tales meant to shock. But Elias's words, spoken with such raw agony, lent them a terrifying truth. Gareth, ever pragmatic, merely grunted, "They are meat, and we are starving. What else is there?" His voice was devoid of judgment, only a bleak acceptance of the inevitable. Kalen recoiled. "Gareth, they are men, made in God's image. God's image is starving, Kalen," Gareth countered, his gaze unwavering. "And God's image is dying. If a man must consume the flesh of another to live, what then? Is it God who condemns him, or the belly that screams for sustenance?" The discussions among the other Crusader leaders were grim and desperate. Some, the more pious, were horrified, clinging to the last vestiges of Christian morality. Others, the more pragmatic, saw it as a terrible necessity. They spoke of the Cannibal Gate, a place where men, stripped of all human dignity, were rumored to hack at the corpses of those slain in battle, boiling their flesh, roasting it, anything to quell the insatiable hunger. Kalen remembered a skirmish from a few weeks prior, a brutal clash near one of Antioch's gates, where Turkish defenders had poured out, only to be repulsed. He remembered the bodies littering the ground, Saracen and Frank alike, and the strange, desperate looks in the eyes of some of his fellow soldiers, a hunger that went beyond the battlefield. He remembered the macabre silence that descended over the battlefield once the fighting ended, a silence that felt less like mourning and more like a predatory hush. The decision, when it was finally made by the most desperate, was not a grand pronouncement, but a slow, agonizing slide into the abyss. It began with the isolated acts of the truly deranged, then spread to those on the brink, finally encompassing those who saw no other path to survival. No one spoke of it openly in polite company, But the signs were there. Men with strangely full bellies while others wasted away, the furtive glances, the hollow, haunted eyes. One bitter morning, Kalen found himself on a foraging party, though foraging was too noble a word for what they did now. They were scavenging. The land around Antioch was a wasteland of bones and frozen mud. They found nothing. As they returned, a small group of foot soldiers, their faces skeletal and their eyes sunken, stumbled upon the body of a fallen comrade, partially covered by a thin layer of snow. He had died the previous night, perhaps of disease, perhaps of the cold. Kalen felt his gorge rise as he watched. One of the soldiers, a man known for his gentle demeanor back in France, knelt beside the corpse. He hesitated, his face a mask of shame and hunger. His hands trembled. Then, with a strangled sob, he pulled out a crude knife and began to hack at the frozen flesh. The others watched, silent, their eyes burning with a terrible hunger, a desperate need that mirrored his own. He saw it, smelled it, the raw, metallic scent, the sickly sweet odor of human flesh. He heard the tearing of sinew, the low, guttural sounds that were not human speech but the whimpers of a predator. He turned away, retching, his stomach rebelling despite its emptiness. Kalen, Garrett's voice was low, devoid of judgment. Look away if you must, but do not judge them. Not now. Not here. How can we not, Gareth? This is monstrous. We are Christians, Knights of Christ. Kalen cried, tears freezing on his cheeks. We are men, Kalen, and hunger is a monster that devours all else, Gareth said, his voice flat. It devours faith, it devours honor, it devours the very soul. And when it has devoured all, it devours the body. The shame was a heavy cloak that settled over the camp. The act was never celebrated, never openly acknowledged except in the most desperate, whispered confessions. What happened? Men survived because of it. The lines between Christian and Saracen, between humanity and beast, were blurred, then erased by the relentless agony of starvation. Kalen saw Brother Elias, his face etched with unspeakable sorrow, ministering to a dying man who, in his delirium, confessed to the unspeakable act. Elias did not condemn, did not recoil. He simply held the man's hand, tears streaming down his own emaciated cheeks, and murmured prayers for forgiveness, for divine understanding for a despairing soul. This was the true horror of Antioch, not just the arrows and the walls, but the slow, agonizing descent into a depravity that defied all moral codes. The Crusaders, once the proud army of God, had been reduced to an animalistic fight for mere existence. They were surrounded by death, living among the dead, and now, for some, feeding on the dead. Kalen felt a cold, deep emptiness settle in his chest, a void where his youthful idealism had once glowed. The cross on his tunic felt like a searing brand of hypocrisy. He had come to reclaim the Holy Land, but in doing so, he wondered if they had lost their souls. Just as despair threatened to consume them entirely, a flicker of hope, or rather, a twist of fate, presented itself. It was the doing of a man named Firas, an Armenian soldier within Antioch's walls, a convert to Islam who harbored a secret resentment against Governor Yagi Sayan. Firas, a skilled armor maker who oversaw one of the city's weakest points, the Tower of the Two Sisters, made contact with Bohemond of Taranto, one of the Crusader leaders. His offer was simple: open a gate in exchange for wealth and safe passage. Bohemond, ever the opportunist, seized upon the chance, keeping it largely secret from the other quarrelsome leaders. The plot was hatched in the dead of night, under a sky that had finally relented its winter fury and hinted at the coming spring. Kalen, along with Gareth and a small detachment of their company, was among the chosen few for the audacious assault. They moved in the pre-dawn hours of June 3rd, 1098, their hearts pounding not from hunger, but from a potent cocktail of fear and a desperate, almost forgotten, hope. The air was thick with tension. Every shadow seemed to hold a Turkish guard, every gust of wind a whisper of betrayal. They reached the designated section of the wall. Firas, true to his word, had lowered a rope ladder. It seemed impossibly flimsy, swaying precariously in the breeze. Gareth went first, a master of stealth despite his years, followed by Kalen, his gaunt frame surprisingly agile. As they ascended, the sounds of the camp below, the coughs, the occasional snore, seemed a world away. Once inside, Phyras led them with a grim urgency. Kalen saw the vastness of the city, still asleep, spread out beneath them. The stench of human habitation, of wood smoke, of sweat, of refuse, was a stark contrast to the sterile, frigid air of their own starving camp. They moved silently through the deserted streets, reaching the main gate known as the Bridge Gate. With practiced, silent movements, they overcame the few sleeping guards, and the heavy bolts were thrown back. The signal was given, a blare of trumpets, a roar that burst from thousands of throats, a sound that had been suppressed for 8 long months. The main Crusader host, starving but galvanized by this sudden, miraculous opportunity, surged forward. Chaos erupted within Antioch. The unsuspecting Turkish garrison, jolted from their sleep, scrambled to respond. But it was too late. The Crusaders, howling like banshees, poured through the open gates. The streets became a river of clashing steel and desperate screams. Kalen fought with a ferocity born of months of deprivation and pent-up rage. He moved through the city like a wraith, his sword a blur, cutting down any who stood in his path. The starvation that had weakened his body seemed to have sharpened his senses, honed his reflexes to a primal edge. The fighting was brutal, a massacre more than a battle. The Crusaders, fueled by months of suffering and a thirst for vengeance, showed no quarter. Men, women, and children were cut down in the streets, their homes set ablaze. The beautiful city of Antioch became a charnel house. The air filled with the cries of the dying, the crackle of flames, and the triumphant, bloodthirsty roars of the Crusaders. Kalen saw men, not just the foot soldiers, but knights, once honorable, now reduced to savage beasts, looting, raping, killing indiscriminately. He tried to focus on the Saracen soldiers, on the fight, but the horror of the scene was overwhelming. He saw Brother Elias, his face pale and horrified, clutching his crucifix as he tried to intervene, to stop the wanton slaughter, but he was a single voice against a deafening tide of vengeance. Governor Yagisayan, seeing all lost, fled the city, only to be caught and beheaded by Armenian villagers. By the end of the day, June 3rd, 1098, Antioch was in Crusader hands. The banners of the cross fluttered atop its impregnable walls. A great cheer rose from the battle-weary survivors, a cry of victory, of deliverance. But the relief was short-lived. Within days, as the Crusaders reveled in their hard-won spoils, gorging themselves on the city's provisions, a new, terrifying threat emerged. Scouts brought dire news. A massive Saracen relief army, led by the formidable Kerboga, Emir of Mosul, was rapidly approaching. This force was far larger, better organized, and more powerful than any they had yet encountered. Unknown to the Crusaders, Kerboga's army had been on its way to relieve Antioch weeks earlier, but had been delayed by a futile siege of Edessa. Now they were here, and they found Antioch, the jewel they were meant to save, in Christian hands. The tables had turned with terrifying speed. The Crusaders, who had just spent 8 months besieging the city, now found themselves besieged within its very walls. The gates they had fought so hard to breach were now bolted against an enemy far superior in numbers. Kerboga's army swiftly encircled Antioch, sealing off every exit. The joy of victory soured into a chilling dread. They had traded one form of hell for another. The provisions they had captured within the city, while a welcome respite, were limited for an army of their size. And now, they were trapped, with no hope of external relief, facing an enemy that dwarfed them. Kalen looked out from the walls he had so desperately yearned to penetrate, now a prisoner within them. The vast plains outside were covered in a sea of Saracen tents, their banners fluttering ominously in the wind. The sound of their drums, a low, constant thrum, vibrated through the ground, a heartbeat of impending doom. The familiar enemy, hunger, returned with a vengeance. The initial feast had quickly depleted the city's stores. The besieged Crusaders once again began to starve, the irony a bitter pill. They had escaped the famine outside, only to find it waiting for them inside. Disease, too, returned, thriving in the cramped, unsanitary conditions of the overcrowded city. Panic began to spread among the Crusader ranks. Desertions, which had paused after the city's fall, now resumed with a desperate intensity. Men tried to scale the walls or lower themselves down, hoping to slip past Kerboga's lines. Few succeeded. Many were caught. Kaelin stood on the ramparts of the Tower of the Two Sisters, the very point where they had breached the city. The sun, a bruised orange, bled across the western sky, casting long, skeletal shadows across the plains below. The air, once thick with the stench of fresh blood, now carried the heavy, cloying scent of sickness and despair. Below, the vast encampment of Kerboga's army stretched to the horizon, a sea of tents and flickering campfires. The low thrum of their drums, a relentless, primal heartbeat, vibrated through the ancient stones beneath Kaelin's worn boots, a constant reminder of their impending doom. Each beat echoed the emptiness in his stomach, the gnawing hunger that had returned with a vengeance, far more insidious than before. He turned his gaze inward, to the city they had so violently claimed. The triumphant banners of the cross, once a symbol of deliverance, now hung limp and tattered atop the walls, mocking their feudal victory. The narrow streets, once a river of blood and joyous shouts, were now quiet, save for the occasional moan, the muffled cough, the hurried footsteps of those carrying away another lifeless form. The grand bazaars were empty, picked clean. The houses, once vibrant with life, were silent shells, their residents either dead or vanished. Gareth stood beside him, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. He said nothing, simply stared out at the enemy host, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, a gesture of instinct more than hope. Brother Elias, whom Kaelin had glimpsed earlier, knelt by the ruins of a desecrated mosque, his crucifix clutched tight, his face a mask of silent, profound sorrow. The holy man looked utterly broken. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in Kaelin's mouth, sharper than any hunger pang. They had clawed their way into Antioch, sacrificed so much, believing it was salvation. Instead, they had merely traded one cage for another, larger, more desolate one. The walls that had once stood as an insurmountable barrier to their freedom now served as an unbreakable prison. As the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into a deep, oppressive twilight, Kaelin looked out at the endless fires of Kerboga's army. The siege was complete. There was no escape, no relief. Only the slow, agonizing wait for the inevitable. The Holy Land had consumed them, one agonizing bite at a time, until only the hollowed-out remnants of their hope remained. The silence that fell over Antioch was not peace, but the heavy, suffocating blanket of a trap sprung shut.